going to be learning about communism, or rather America's fear of communism. This fear is known as the Red Scare. Communists are known as the Reds. Most communist countries in the world have a great deal of red in their flag. If you look from the Soviet Union to China, sort of the symbol for communism has always been red. And so this is called the Red Scare. And there's a long history of fear of communism in America. And part of that fear is largely because it requires a great deal of government control, something that our traditional laissez-faire capitalist system doesn't really like. And true capitalism cannot have that much government control. So we're going to learn a little bit about capitalism and communism, and also why events that have happened and why Americans are so fearful of communism and things that have happened in that fear. So communism is an economic theory. It was propagated by this man named Karl Marx. He was a German who grew up living in England during their Industrial Revolution. His theory says and propagates this idea that all day the people and the workers will own all the ways of making money. All the land, all the machines, all the stores, and that there will be no private business. There will be no way for one person to become very rich. Everything will be communal, and so there's this great idea of the community working together to benefit everyone. This theory is super idealistic. It's really a great idea for everybody working together, everybody sharing the land, everybody sharing the machines, everybody sharing the stores, and no one person capitalizing, so literally the opposite of capitalism. Nobody is capitalizing on the resources or taking advantage of the resources or taking advantage of other people's failures. Everybody is working together for the benefit of the whole. In practice, this theory has required a great deal of government control. Typically, communist countries the communist economic theory is governed by some sort of dictatorship or some sort of oligarchy where a small group of people are basically laying out the plans for who gets to control what, who owns what, and how are people benefiting and working to benefit the whole. In practice, this theory hasn't really worked out very well. Some people that are pro-communism would argue that true communism hasn't ever actually been outlined, and it hasn't ever been put into practice, and that it really could work. We just have to really commit to true communism and get away from dictatorships running the communist economy. You may have heard of the word socialism. Socialism is somewhere between the laissez-faire capitalism of the Industrial Revolution and communism, where the government controls everything. Today, many people believe in socialist ideas without necessarily believing in communism. Some signs of socialism would be government owning major private businesses, like, the National Bank, government owning major public services, like hospitals and healthcare, or railroads for that matter, and laws that make people rich contribute more taxes so that there isn't a huge difference between the rich and poor. So basically taxing the rich and giving to the poor, providing shelters and things like that. Those are all examples of socialism in practice. This could also be considered a mixed economy. In the United States, there has been a long history of fear of communism, and anybody who has socialist tendencies have often been accused of being communists. So this is suppression of socialist ideas, because the ideas of communism and socialism threaten individuals' right to private wealth. So the idea there is that it threatens this idea that if you work hard, you own what you own, and it basically says the government can take those things away from you, and many people don't really like that. Communism and socialism can also threaten can also threaten basically the ideas of well, I worked really hard for this, I own this, my family passed this down to me, and these ideas basically say, no, the community owns this, and you don't really own anything. And basically everything in the U.S. Constitution protects an individual's right to their wealth. And so these ideas are really against sort of the fundamental things that we outlined in our Constitution. Progressives that we learned about during the Progressive era advocated to basically correct the woes of the laissez-faire capitalism. Industrialization created a huge gap between the rich and the poor, and when people looked around, they thought that that wasn't fair, and they wanted the government to do something about that lack of fairness. So basically, we tried this laissez-faire economy, and it didn't work out in the eyes of the progressives. Certainly, there are people that say that we didn't really try hard enough to have a good laissez-faire economy, and that eventually it would have worked out. Many people joined labor unions. Not all labor unions were socialists. Some, like the American Federation of Labor, thought that they would be more successful by only organizing skilled workers. But some labor unions, like the International Workers of the World, the IWW, were socialists and wanted all workers to unite. Black, white, men, women, skilled, unskilled, it didn't matter. In 1917, the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia established a communist country known as the Soviet Union. Many people in the United States were inspired by their success. Others were really scared by the potential that communism might spread to the United States. In the early to mid-1900s, some people were also anarchists, people like Emma Goldman, for example. People who didn't believe in any government. They felt like nobody should tell us what to do. Some anarchists thought that the government should be overthrown with violence and that people should be able to basically make decisions on their own. Although anarchists, socialists, and communists shared some of the same ideas, for example, they all opposed government protection of private wealth, they represented different theories. So, in the 1920s, the United States began implementing immigration quotas to stop the flow of radical people from coming to the United States. In 1921, they passed the Emergency Quota Act. And then in 1924, they passed an Immigration Act. These limited the annual number of immigrants from a nation to 2% of number of immigrants living in the United States in 1890. So you can see by this political cartoon, it was kind of like we put a funnel on who could come in, and we really highly restricted who could come to the United States, which seems really contrary to the fact that we really are this melting pot of immigrants, and now we're cutting back and restricting who can immigrate to the United States. And even today, our restrictions on immigrations are so high that people are coming to our country illegally, because there's no, or rather, it's really difficult to come to our country legally. Immigration from most Asian nations stopped, and in this becomes a problem with Pearl Harbor because Japanese are no longer allowed to immigrate, and it's the first early sign of discrimination against Asian peoples. And that, of course, adding to the Chinese Immigration Act. Some groups were given preference over others. Obviously, Europeans were given preference. There was a great deal of discrimination, though, and fear, nativism against immigrants. There's two people, Sacco and Vanzetti. These two people were Italians who were charged with robbery and murder. They were Italian immigrants. They were convicted of this crime on highly circumstantial evidence, meaning they happened to be Italian, and the people were looking for Italians, and they, happened to be in the vicinity of this crime, but there was no real evidence that they actually did this crime, and they were sentenced to death. Many protested their death. Many protested while they were in jail, and the whole sentence. But these two people were in fact executed in 1927. Later, they were able to do a ballistics test. Ballistics tests didn't exist before that, and they found that the gun that was found, I believe, on Sacco, was actually the gun that was fired and used to kill this person. But there was no evidence to connect Sacco to the gun. So it was found on him, but there was no evidence that he actually shot the gun. So it was really circumstantial. And this particular case really highlights how fearful people in the United States in the 1920s were of people that were different. Even though these people are Italians and are still white, they were still Catholic. They were still coming from this fascist country and had all these fascist ideas, and it was people were really fearful of them. In 1920, the GOP nominated Ohio Senator Warren G. Harding. He gets elected. GOP is the Republican Party. He is elected on his plan to bring back normalcy, to get away from all these progressive socialist, communist ideas, and to bring back the true American spirit. And then he won in a Republican landslide. So the Red Scare was begun by Russia's Bolshevik Revolution in 1917. All these things start, and this really deep fear is begun by this revolution that's happening. Fear of communist revolution in the United States really propagated people to and pushed people to start accusing one another of being communists, start locking up communists, and these people start taking the blame for a lot of society's woes. Haymarket Square riot is a really good example of that, where they lock up anarchists and other people that are advocating different systems, largely just because we're fearful of these types of radicals. This was heightened by 1919 with the anarchist bombings, and there was also the passage of various sedition laws, which locked up people like Eugene Debs and Schneck, and so these are all different instances where people are retaliating against communist ideals. The Palmer raids. U.S. Attorney General A. Mitchell Palmer sought to eliminate the radical influences in the United States. And so he appointed a man named J. Edgar Hoover to lead investigations. He actually becomes the head of the FBI. And Hoover went around and he jailed many people who had communist tendencies, and he deported them illegally in many cases. The rights of many of these suspects to freedom of speech, to fair trial in front of a jury, and other things like that, all of these rights by many of these people were violated. Mitchell Palmer wrote this piece. You don't need to write this down in your notes or anything like that, but this was his case that he made against the Reds. He says, "It has been impossible in so short a space to review the entire menace of the internal revolution in this country as I know it. But this may serve to arouse the American citizen to its reality, its danger, its great need of united effort to stamp it out under our feet if it need be. It is being done. The Department of Justice will pursue the attack of these Reds upon the government of the United States with vigilance, and no alien advocating the overthrow of existing law and order in this country shall escape arrest and prompt deportation. It is my belief that while these have stirred discontent in our midst, while they have caused irritating strikes, and while they have infected our social ideas with the disease of their own minds and their own unclean morals, we can rid of them. And not until we have done so shall we have removed the menace of Bolshevism for good." A big thing that we need to think about is whether or not this case against the Reds was justified. Do you think that this is something that we should have been fearful of? do you buy the fact that they have stirred discontent in our midst, or do you think that it's okay to have discontent with our system of government, especially in reaction to the way things were during the Industrial Revolution? In this speech, it appears that Palmer is using fairly charged terms like irritating, disease, unclean morals to rally support for removing the menace of the Reds. However, he does not back up his claims in this with any evidence or eyewitness accounts to support his arguments. Instead, he appeals to his audience's fear of what he describes, and probably largely based on pro-capitalist, pro-democracy propaganda being put out at the time. So this is an interesting question and an interesting thing to think about as we move forward and look at the Cold War. So this is the context of what's American fear of Reds in our country as we're moving forward.